Okay, thank you for that. Hello, everybody, and thank you all for attending the session today. My name is Catherine Cooper-Hayes. I have a PhD in hydraulic engineering from the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and a background working as a water resources consultant, doing a wide range of engineering design and analysis, which is becoming increasingly focused on climate change and disaster risk reduction. In that vein, I'm here to talk today to share with you some of the work that I've been doing alongside and under the guidance of Bapon Fakrudin, who has a wealth of experience in disaster risk reduction and early warning systems that he will share with you in the next presentation. And so I'll be sharing with you today some of the work that we've been doing on the principles of the hydromet value chain, and applying that theory to case studies in Somalia and Samoa. And so the hydromet service delivery value chain is a way of considering or grouping the elements that as a whole create an end-to-end early warning system. The value chain can apply to hydrometeorological hazards or to all hazards, multi-hazards, such as including geohazards and sometimes other hazards such as pandemics. Each component of the value chain is critical to the success of the system. And like a chain, a weak link can prevent the system from performing, which can cost lives and costly damages. I will talk through each of the components in a little more detail throughout the rest of this presentation as I present the work that we've recently completed in Samoa and Somalia, where we applied the principles of the hydromet value chain to hydrometeorological services in both countries. So first of all, just a brief overview of Samoa. So we worked on developing the Samoa early warning system in 2018, and some of that work is still ongoing. The project is part of the Pacific Resilience Program, which is focused on strengthening resilience, early warning and preparedness to natural hazards. As many of you will know, Samoa consists of two large main islands, Upolu and Savaii, with some smaller islands clustered around. Its position at the Pacific makes it particularly exposed to tropical cyclones and earthquake-generated tsunamis, but also experiences other natural hazards, including coastal and riverine flooding, and as well as that, it's they're volcanic islands, so that's a hazard to them as well. Climate change is a major threat to Samoa. Both the people, the economy, the island has some low-lying communities that would be exposed to sea level rise, and it has a strong dependence on fisheries and tourism, agriculture, all of which can be affected by climate change. So the Samoa Meteorology Division is well established. It's been around for a long time and has benefited from the support of government and various aid and development projects over recent decades, as well as it benefits from strong regional support in the Pacific and has close ties with the Fijian Meteorology Office. Somalia is as you know, a completely different story, just based on the tip of around the Horn of Africa. Somalia is ranked one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. It faces persistent climate shocks and is ranked 15th on the United Kingdom Department for International Development's list of developing countries at high disaster risk. It frequently faces droughts followed by flash floods, and decades of conflict compounded by recurring disasters have contributed to the displacement of 2.6 million people across Somalia, and increased water for land and water to support animals and crops is resulting in food insecurity and poverty in a extremely high proportion of its population are dependent on livestock and agriculture. So yeah, approximately 70% of the population is engaged in agropastoralism and subsistence agriculture. And their rapid urbanisation is occurring due to economic and government drivers, as well as climate change impacts, as well as environmental degradation and exploitation of natural resources. So there's no single hydrometeorological service currently in Somalia. Rather, a few agencies provide services to meet user needs. For example, the Aviation Authority there plays one of the leading roles in meteorological services. But I think, importantly, conflict has caused extensive damage to the hydrometeorological service, and so much of their existing infrastructure has been damaged, and only sort of, I think, since 2012, under new governance has that started to rebuild. Somalia is supported by regional services such as the IGAD Climate Prediction and Application Centre and the SWALAM project, which is put on by the Food and Agricultural Organization, by the UN. Yeah, so that's just a brief outline of the two countries. So just thinking about the assessment process that we've been through for both of those countries, we followed a similar process for both, and despite the differences in maturity of both hydromet services in each country, similar processes were followed to form recommendations for the development of the hydromet chain. And we also drew on the World Meteorological Organization, which has got some excellent guidance available. And for example, the figure in this slide from the guidelines for establishing a national framework for climate services shows the various groups, organisations and other stakeholders who are important in this process. And if you look closely, we've got external data providers, in-country data providers, sector experts, boundary organisations, national level users and community level users. So that sums up basically everybody in the country. And so it's it just shows you how widely spread the hydrometeorological services are in terms of the effect that they have, as well as the contributions from various parties, both from a user end and also from a service delivery end. So the first step in the process that we undertook was to perform a baseline assessment and an inception report, part of which is identifying the stakeholders, as well as, and that includes the service providers, as well as end users and government and aid agencies. And so the stakeholder engagement was one of the foundations of reviewing the hydromet value chain. It can help you identify what you've got to work with and what you need, and what the services are that the country needs and wants. And as well, up there, I've also got the SWOT and PESEL analysis, which are I thought worth mentioning because they're both quite useful tools to help you clarify the process and understand the country that you're working in. So thinking about policy and legislation as the first step in the hydromet value chain, having strong policy and legislation foundation is critical. It gives a mandate to the Met Service and provides clarity around the process and relationships between service providers. Both Samoa and Somalia had more than one agency in country that was collecting data and providing hydromet services, but neither had a clear institutional arrangement that clearly defined the roles of the agencies. And so that leaves a potential for miscommunication and gaps, and can really be a weak link in the delivery chain. And even if there is a single Met Service operating, there are still interfaces between the Met Service and other parties who have roles such as Disaster Management Office, emergency services, climate researchers. And so policy and legislation really helps to form that, strengthen those relationships and ensure a smooth process of issuing warnings and identifying which parties are involved and what the who the decision makers are and what that process is. So ideally, when we're working towards our identifying policy and legislation, we're aiming for an organisational structure that spans all responsibilities required to effectively operate and maintain the early warning system, as well as identify complementary roles that are not overlapping in responsibilities of all organisations, and distribute roles in a way that considers the practicality of implementation and is sensitive to staff capabilities and the capacity of the in-country service. And so often we would see, well, in both Somalia and Samoa, these Met services have got limited staff, and it's really difficult to find more staff. So having that an understanding of what the capability is of the in-house, the existing staff, and how they can get more people is also critical to both the policy and legislation, but also throughout the analysis. So thinking about the Earth data observation. So suitable Earth data observation are critical for detecting hazards. The observational equipment needs to be located to meet hazard warning needs and be the right type. So some countries will have almost complete absence of some type of equipment, as for example, ocean data. But that's also reflects the different needs of users in different countries. And so, for example, in Samoa, just in terms of day-to-day Met Service needs, the people of Samoa on a daily basis experience a really similar weather pattern. They have quite predictable rainfall throughout the day, and so they don't have this same kind of dependence on a Met Service in terms of their their forecasting as, for example, in New Zealand, where we check the weather about 5 times a day, because you never know what the next day is going to hold because the weather is quite variable. Yeah, so each country is going to have different needs in terms of that type of observational equipment. But typically a network will have hydromet stations. So we've got automatic telemetry weather stations, and as well as that, stream gauges. We've got tide gauges and wave buoys, seismic observation, upper air observations, and Doppler radars potentially as well. So monitoring data relative to the hazard and transmission frequency needs to be considered. So it depends on what type of hazard that you're monitoring as to how frequently you need to be sending that data back to your Met Service office, and as well as that, you need to always be considering your maintenance and running costs, because there's no point in having a service that is not maintained, because that's when gaps are going to occur in your value chain. So thinking about modelling and assessment, that supports the hazard detection and assessment. Electronic hardware, operating systems, data analysis software, all of it's going to work together to provide you your forecasting and your hazard detection. So this is a real point where you've got to have the software and the data platforms. You've got to have good data communication between your agencies as well. And so hazard assessment underpins the design of an early warning system. So understanding the hazard criteria is necessary to identify the severity of a hazard and your level of exposure. So that can tell you which locations are most at risk, and help, for example, to determine which low-risk areas can be designated as evacuation zones. So it's got all of those different components in there where it's telling you a lot about how this weather is going to affect your population. And then, the impact-based forecast, that links warnings to potential impacts associated with the forecast and the information needed to mitigate or reduce risk. informed through the hazard assessment and vulnerability, risk assessment, impacts and the studies of risk perception. And so in this phase, stakeholder engagement is instrumental in informing the process to understand the needs. So the wording of the forecasts and the warnings that you're issuing, the timeliness, and what's going to be actionable. So do your users need to have a whole day in order to move this cattle away from the field that's going to get flooded, or can they move within an hour or so? And that leads me to the reasons for warning failure. So sometimes your warning's not understood, and that relates back to risk perception. Other times it's understood but ignored, and that can relate back to your risk knowledge. And then other times it could be understood, not ignored, but still no response. And then that leads you to think about what your infrastructure is, and your impact assessment, and your can people move? Do they know where to go? Have they got the right places to go to? Is there somewhere else that's safe, or do they really have no options? And also related to that is the communication, which is really critical for making sure that all of the hard work and effort in the earlier stages of the value chain really get delivered to the right people at the right time. So it includes communication with agencies, from observations to the modelling forecasts, scientists, and then to decision makers and disaster managers, who are then responsible for issuing the warnings, which could be issued by alerts, advisories, and cell phone use, that kind of thing, and even often sirens as well. I'm just racing through because I'm running out of time, but business continuity, I think, is really important, and it's something that I think we're seeing more of. We're focusing on the internal processes as well as a continuity, and making sure that internally the organisation understands the process of what's going to happen during a disaster, but then also throughout the operation of the system, making sure that there's efficiencies and good focus on customers, effective management, all sorts of things that it's not just related to hydromet value chain, but throughout all businesses, this is something that applies. So that's the last element on the chain. And then this shows it's just an assessment summary, which is a useful tool to just have a quick look. I think this one's from Somalia, which just shows you most of it needs improvement. Some of them are satisfactory. So it's just, I think, a useful tool to just be able to classify them and see just at a glance what needs doing, and where does each of the components of the systems sit. And then thinking about the next steps for these projects following the assessment of the hydromet value chain. So in the initial stage, we do the assessment of the sort of background, then working through our stakeholder consultation, make our assessment of the value chain, and then recommendations from that, followed by an action plan and risk assessment. For Somalia, it was a completely different stage to Samoa. So Somalia is really at the stage where they need guidance on what their, I guess, the early parts of the hydromet value chain, like what legislation, what policy do they need to put in place to really make their system work effectively, whereas Samoa, they also needed that, but because they've got a lot of equipment already and a lot of processes, it's sort of a more fine-tuning kind of situation there. So two quite different countries, but both had really interesting applications for the hydromet value chain. And I will leave it there. Thank you for listening, and open the floor to